What if I told you that Iran walked directly into a trap? A trap so precisely constructed, so methodically laid out, that by the time Tehran realized what was happening, there was nothing left to do about it. This isn't speculation. This is what actually unfolded in the Strait of Hormuz, and the full picture is something the mainstream media is barely touching. Stay with me because the next 11 minutes are going to fundamentally shift the way you look at this entire situation. You're watching Military Nexus. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and smash the like button because we cover the stories that actually carry weight, the ones with real consequences for real people. And today's story is one of the most significant of the year. Don't click away because the twist comes later and you are absolutely going to want to be here for it. Let's start at the beginning because to truly understand what happened in Hormuz, you have to first understand why the strait matters as much as it does. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow stretch of water positioned between Iran and Oman, roughly 21 miles across at its tightest point. And through that narrow corridor flows nearly 20% of the entire world's oil supply. 20%. Let that number sit for a moment. Every time you pull up to a pump and fill your tank, there's a very real possibility that oil passed through Hormuz at some point on its journey. This is not just an important waterway, it is one of the most strategically decisive choke points anywhere on the planet. Iran knows this. Iran has always known this. For decades, Tehran has treated the Strait of Hormuz as its most powerful piece of leverage. Every time tensions escalate, every time sanctions tighten, every time Washington starts turning up the pressure, Iranian officials step to the microphone and deliver the same message. We can close Hormuz. We can bring it all to a halt. And for a long time, the world took that threat seriously, because on paper, Iran genuinely does possess the capability to cause significant disruption in those waters. They have fast attack vessels, anti-ship missile systems, naval mines, and a Revolutionary Guard naval force that has spent years training specifically for operations inside the Gulf. So when tensions between the United States and Iran began climbing again this time around, the world braced itself for another round of Hormuz brinkmanship. Shipping companies grew anxious. Oil markets started reacting. Analysts began running the same familiar scenarios they always pull out whenever Iran starts flexing in the Gulf. And right on schedule, Iran started making its moves. Naval patrols increased. Loud statements about Iran's ability to dominate the waterway filled the airwaves. Assets were repositioned, and signals of strength were broadcast. From the outside, it looked exactly like Iran was preparing to play its favorite card one more time. But here is precisely where the story shifts. Because what Iran failed to recognize, or perhaps chose to dismiss, is that the United States had been preparing for this exact moment. Not just in a general sense, but preparing specifically, methodically, and with a level of strategic depth that Iran had dangerously underestimated. Washington had spent months quietly repositioning assets, revising its operational scenarios, and most critically, rewriting the rules of engagement in ways Iran hadn't fully calculated. The United States wasn't reacting to Iranian moves this time around. Washington had already written the next 3 chapters of the story before Iran had even made its opening move. The trap had 3 distinct layers, and each one was more sophisticated than the one before it. The first layer was economic. The United States coordinated closely with its Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, to ensure that any Iranian attempt to disrupt traffic through Hormuz would immediately activate a prearranged response through alternative oil routes. The pipelines, the backup shipping corridors, the emergency reserve release mechanisms, all of it was already mapped out and ready to deploy within hours. If Iran moved to close Hormuz, the global oil supply wouldn't collapse. It would simply reroute, and Iran's leverage would dissolve almost immediately. The Americans had effectively removed the most dangerous round from Iran's weapon before the standoff even began. The second layer was technological, and this is where things become genuinely fascinating. The U.S. Navy has made substantial upgrades to its electronic warfare capabilities across the Gulf region over the past several years. We're talking about systems capable of disrupting Iranian communications, degrading their drone coordination, and neutralizing the effectiveness of the fast boat swarm tactics that have historically been among Iran's most reliable tools in confined waterways like Hormuz. Iran's military planners had constructed their entire Hormuz playbook around specific assumptions about what their equipment could accomplish and how American forces would respond. Those assumptions were now dangerously out of date. The third layer was the one Iran likely anticipated least, the diplomatic and informational layer. The United States had quietly assembled a coalition of partners who were all monitoring the Hormuz situation with close attention and were fully prepared to immediately and publicly condemn any Iranian provocation. This matters more than it might initially seem, because Iran's Hormuz strategy has never been purely military. It has always been partly about narrative, about projecting strength, about demonstrating to the region and the broader world that Tehran cannot be pushed into a corner. If the diplomatic response was already primed and ready to deploy the moment Iran acted, Iran wouldn't just lose the military exchange, it would lose the narrative contest as well, which for a country operating under sustained international pressure might actually be the more damaging outcome. So what did Iran do once it began to sense the trap closing around it? This is the part that tells you everything you need to know about where Iranian strategic thinking currently stands. Rather than pulling back quietly and cleanly, Iran doubled down first. The rhetoric escalated. The statements grew louder. Naval exercises were staged specifically to send a message, and for a brief window, it genuinely looked as though Iran might follow through on a serious provocation. The tension in the Gulf during that period was real. Markets moved, naval forces repositioned, the world collectively held its breath, and then the whole thing deflated, not through an explosion, not through a military clash, but through something arguably more revealing. Iran blinked. The provocative posturing quietly wound down. The naval exercises concluded without a single significant incident. The threat stopped being repeated with any conviction, and the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile corridor Iran had been brandishing like a weapon over everyone's heads, remained open, remained operational, and remained in every meaningful practical sense beyond Iran's ability to control. Now here is where mainstream coverage gets this moment badly wrong. Most reporting framed this as a non-event. Nothing happened. The tension passed. Time to move on. But that framing completely misreads what actually took place. Something very significant did happen. Iran probed the strategic environment and discovered that the playbook it has relied on for decades no longer functions the way it once did. They telegraphed their intentions, they positioned for a confrontation, and then they found that the Americans had already accounted for every piece on the board. That is not simply a tactical setback. That is a strategic revelation that fundamentally changes how Iran can project power going forward. Consider what Iran's leadership now has to process internally. The Hormuz threat has been the centerpiece of Iranian strategic deterrence for a generation. Military planners in Tehran have built budgets, training pipelines, and political narratives around the idea that Hormuz is the trump card, the single piece of leverage that gives Iran genuine weight against Western pressure. If that card has now been significantly devalued, it forces an enormous internal reckoning. What is the contingency plan? Where does the leverage come from now? These are deeply uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions inside authoritarian political systems don't tend to produce clean, rational policy outcomes. They produce internal friction, blame redistribution, and sometimes dangerous overreaction. And that is actually one of the most critical things to track going forward. Not just what Iran does externally, but what happens inside the Iranian decision-making structure as competing factions attempt to explain what just happened and chart a path forward. The hardliners will push for intensified aggression. The pragmatists will argue for strategic recalibration. The supreme leadership will have to navigate between those competing pressures while simultaneously managing an economy that is genuinely struggling under the weight of sanctions and a population that is not exactly rallying behind the national flag right now. It is an internally combustible situation, and the Hormuz miscalculation has only added fuel to it. Meanwhile, the Gulf Arab states are quietly drawing their own conclusions from everything they just witnessed. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have spent years carefully hedging, maintaining strong relationships with Washington while keeping back channels open with Tehran and exploring strategic partnerships with Beijing and Moscow. They are perpetually calculating where real regional power actually resides, and what they just observed in Hormuz is another concrete data point telling them that Iranian power has real and enforceable limits, limits that American strategic planning actively shapes and maintains. That calculation carries enormous implications for the regional balance of power and for the decisions Gulf states will make around defense investment, diplomatic alignment, and economic partnerships in the years ahead. There's also a China dimension to this story that almost nobody is discussing. Beijing has been investing heavily across the Middle East, cultivating relationships with both Iran and the Gulf states simultaneously, and positioning itself as a credible alternative to American influence in the region. China imports massive volumes of oil that move through Hormuz. Any serious Iranian disruption of the strait would damage Chinese economic interests just as severely as Western ones, perhaps more so in certain scenarios. This creates a striking dynamic where Chinese pressure on Tehran to behave responsibly in Hormuz actually reinforces American strategic interests without any formal coordination between the two. Washington and Beijing share a fundamental interest in keeping Hormuz open, and Iran has to navigate a world where even its closest supposed partners have concrete reasons not to back its most extreme gambits. Here is the broader picture that ties everything together. What we watched play out in the Strait of Hormuz was not simply another episode of geopolitical tension that arrived and departed without consequence. It was a live stress test of Iran's strategic position, and Iran did not pass. The trap succeeded because it wasn't purely military. It was economic, technological, diplomatic, and informational simultaneously. That kind of multi-layered strategic approach is genuinely difficult to counter, particularly for a country already operating under significant resource constraints and deep internal political pressures. Iran entered the situation believing it was playing its strongest card. It exited having discovered that card has been substantially downgraded. Does this mean Iran is finished as a regional force? Absolutely not. Iran still maintains its proxy networks, still holds influence in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria, still possesses ballistic missile capabilities that no regional actor takes lightly, and still has a leadership that is ideologically committed to resisting American and Israeli influence. Iran is not going anywhere, and it is not about to transform into a cooperative partner in some reimagined regional order. But what this moment does represent is a meaningful and measurable erosion in the confidence and effectiveness with which Iran can project power in its most critical domain. And that erosion carries ripple effects that will continue playing out for years to come. Military Nexus is going to keep watching this story with close attention, because the aftermath is always where the most consequential action unfolds. The choices Iran makes in the coming months, whether to recalibrate, to escalate further, or to search for a diplomatic exit, will define the trajectory of Middle East security for the foreseeable future. The decisions about whether to press the strategic advantage will matter enormously, and the recalculations underway in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and beyond will further reshape the regional landscape in ways that remain genuinely difficult to predict from where we stand right now. What you just watched was not a crisis that quietly fizzled out. It was a turning point that most people haven't recognized as a turning point yet. And that is exactly the kind of story Military Nexus exists to bring you. Real analysis, deeper context, the substance that actually helps you understand what is happening in the world and why it matters directly to you. Before you go, drop a comment below and tell us, do you think Iran recalibrates after this? Or are we moving toward a much larger confrontation down the road? We want to hear your take, and if this video gave you something real to think about, share it with someone who needs to see it, because these conversations genuinely matter. The more people who are actually informed, the better. We'll see you in the next one.